2.4 Overview, Trans-Saharan Trade Routes. So for our essential question, we have causation. Here are the causes and effects of trans-Saharan trade. And for how did the growth of empires influence trade and communication, this word influence, if you think about it, is really very similar to an effect. So this question is really sort of giving us some more information about the kinds of effects we'll be looking for, which is looking at how empires grew and what their influence was. So one of the effects of the trans-Saharan trade was the growth of empires and their influence on trade and communication. So again, just to kind of remind you, this is going to be a causation. So let's talk about the relevance of this topic. This map over here is current, and it shows the Islamic population in West Africa. And one of the things we'll be looking at today is the fact that trans-Saharan trade coming across here from North Africa brought Islam from North Africa to West Africa. There's also a theme in this topic we just talked about on the previous slide about the relationship between government and trade, and the fact that nowadays governments manage trade a lot. They build infrastructure, they build ports, airports, of course, in 2019, and also they tax all of that. And so the patterns that we'll be looking at in this video having to do with, 800 years ago, how governments manage trade are still with us today. Context. So what I started with is what I thought was some important background information. The fact that this trans-Saharan trade network was already around. It's not a brand new thing here. The fact that Islam, was an existing religion, and a little bit about geography and the barrier of the Sahara Desert, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So here's my success criteria up here. So I'm looking for specific details, some explanation of the connection, and that the things I put in there should not be in the body of the essay. So here's what I came up with. In the centuries before 1200, traders had sought to connect North and West Africa as they both had goods the other desired. A challenge was to cross the Sahara Desert, and advancements in technology would help them do that. Starting in the 8th century, Islamic empires spread across North Africa, putting them on the edge of the trans-Saharan trade network in a prime location to influence trade and government. So I'm kind of thinking of that gap between North and West Africa, and I'm talking a little bit about the fact that Islam was in existence in North Africa before this time period. And that's going to help set up some of these arguments I'll be making in the chapter about the relationship between North and West Africa. So the first section of the book is called Trans-Saharan Trade. We have a pretty general statement over here about the causes and effects of the growth of trans-Saharan trade. And in this section, we're focusing on existing transportation technologies. And I put this in purple because that's our color for the technology theme. So the first thing we're talking about is oases. That's plural for the word oasis. And if you look at the satellite image, it's just a reminder of how forbidden this terrain is, this desert. And what we're talking about here is trade networks, headed in this direction. That's trans-Saharan. And then down here in West Africa, this is the area that we're going to be connecting to North Africa. And just a reminder that once trade has come up here to the edges of the Sahara Desert, it's now accessing the Mediterranean trade. From there, those goods can go up here into Europe. They also can go down here through the Red Sea and access the Indian Ocean trade. And there's also ports on the eastern edge of the Mediterranean that can access the Silk Roads trade. So even though we talk about 3 different trade networks, Trans-Saharan over here, Indian Ocean, and Silk Roads, there are really places where they're interconnected, and the Mediterranean is really one of those places where they all sort of overlap. Okay, so back to these oases. Because of this forbidding desert terrain, you need some places to stop along the way, and we'll talk about these caravans up here in a minute. So on this map, they're a little hard to see, but all these dots right here, these are oases. So it's just kind of a reminder that as they make the journey, there's these stopping places. And the book talks about a camel being able to go 100 miles without water. And so that's a good stopping distance. Another piece of technology is the camel saddle. There was a camel saddle for riders, and camels were even used in war. But for our purposes, for the trade network, the cargo saddle is really the important one. So you've seen this picture over here. There's someone riding a camel up there, but really we're talking about this guy right here, and the fact that you can have these caravans and load up the camels, and they can be your cargo animals. These caravans got very large, sometimes up to thousands of camels. You see in this picture here. And as they get bigger and bigger, you have more and more goods that can be produced. And of course, that's going to get back to this idea of the growth of trade. And then over here. So That's why the camel saddle and the caravans are important, because they allow it to expand the amount of trade. And then just a reminder that the motivation for doing this, because it is a pretty difficult journey to make, is that West Africa, even before the trade network really expands during this time period, was known for its wealth. And there's a fabulous amount of gold naturally in West Africa, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. And then a reminder that Islam, which started right here, spread throughout North Africa. So when we look at this trade network at this time, these are Islamic states up here. And we'll talk in future videos about how Islam spread to West Africa. Okay, so the next section is about West African empires, and this section here says explain how the expansion influenced trade and communication. And we'll look at empires like Mali in West Africa and how they facilitated trade and communication. Just a reminder that back in 1.5 you studied about Ghana, which was a pre-existing West African kingdom, and it fell by the 12th century and was replaced by Mali. Like Ghana did, Mali relied on gold as their primary source of revenue. They also expanded their taxing of trade so that they made more money. Timbuktu, which is shown right here on this map, was a major center of Islamic scholarship and an important center for trade as well. So as states like Mali expand, often by conquest, they have access to more trade and resources. So the original Mali expanded in this direction during this time period to include Timbuktu as part of its empire. So if you look down here at this map of the early West African kingdoms, you can see that they get bigger. So this was Ghana here. Mali makes it out about to this area, and then Songhay, which we'll talk about in a little bit, comes all the way over here. So there's kind of a gradual expansion, and trade and resources is kind of a big motivator for doing that. So now we'll talk about Mansa Musa, who is known in a lot of historical circles as the richest person who ever lived. And this is because he was the king of Mali, and there was so much gold in Mali, and under the law, it all belonged to him, that's where this idea comes from of him being the richest person ever. He was a devout Muslim, and he made a pilgrimage to Mecca, which was quite famous. That's what this is a picture of. All Muslims are expected, if they're able, at least once in their life, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, which is where the religion was founded. When Mansa Musa went to Mecca, he brought thousands of people with him and an incredible kind of entourage of, it was a camel caravan, horses, slaves, servants, courtiers. It was just an incredible sight, and a lot of people wrote about it. And in fact, on his way to Mecca, he passed through Cairo, which is up in northeast Africa. And he gave away so much gold in Cairo that he ruined their economy, because gold became so cheap because there was so much of it that it took 10 years for their economy to recover. So this pilgrimage that he made really deepened his faith and made him a more devout Muslim. And when he returned to Mali, he built a lot of schools and mosques. So the Timbuktu here became known, in addition to being a trading city, as an Islamic scholarship center. And that helped to intensify the practice of the religion in West Africa. So Mansa Musa was an extremely powerful ruler, and after he died, the kingdom existed for a while, but by 1400 it started to decline, and it was replaced by Songhay, and they really used the same techniques we've talked about in terms of relying on gold as the source of revenue and taxing and managing the trade to become wealthy. So that's kind of the big theme of this section, that what states do to facilitate the trade is they tax the merchants, they tax the trade that happens, and they use the money that they get from taxes to build needed infrastructure for the trade to exist. You know, that can be a marketplace. It can be to encourage oasis towns. It can be to encourage accounting centers. Anything that is needed to fuel this trade. So now for our timeline, we're mostly looking at these empires right here. So Ghana, we started with, and remember this is technically before our time period, but just a reminder that there had been a kingdom in West Africa that was engaging in the early trans-Saharan trade. And then we get Mali, and then Songhay. And Mali technically lasted until 1600, but in about the 1400s, it begins to decline and is sort of replaced by Songhay. So in case you're wondering, that's why that date here says 1600, and so does Songhay. And just a reminder that Mansa Musa was a king of Mali, and you can tell that by looking at his dates and realizing that they're inside this range of time. So now to go over the essential question, we started with the causes of trans-Saharan trade, and I guess I could probably add here expansion because it's really kind of growing during this time period. And we have those technologies like oases, which allow you to stop along the way, and the camel saddle and the camel caravan, which increase the amount of goods, allowing the trade to expand. And then for effects, we have the growth of states, especially in West Africa. So the main one we focused on was Mali. And then the other effect is the spread of Islam to West Africa. For instance, if you remember Timbuktu being a center of Islamic scholarship. Then another question part of that was how these empires influenced trade and communication. So Mansa Musa's journey to Mecca is an example of communication, which encouraged the spread of Islam. And then, of course, the actions that they took that we kind of finished the video with in terms of them building infrastructure, allowing taxes to happen so that people can profit from the trade is another way that empires influenced it. That's your chapter 2.4 overview. Happy studying!
A global warming is on the threat for you.